This happened to me a few years ago in the fall when I decided to throw a Halloween party. Some of my friends told me that Costco was the best place to buy supplies in bulk. I didn't have a Costco membership card, but my sister did, and I thought it looked similar enough to her for this not to be an issue. When I arrived at the entrance, I noticed a male employee checking for membership cards. I wasn't concerned about this as I had a card to wave at him. It was the checkout part when they looked over the photo ID that I was worried about. When my turn came, he didn't wave me past straight away as he did the other customers. Instead, he looked me up and down and smiled. He kinda gave me the creeps, but he eventually waved me past, and now inside the store, I just wanted to get the party supplies and deal with the checkout ID issue as quickly as possible. There were pallets stacked full of Halloween decorations, but it was crowded there. Kids everywhere kept setting off the screeching skeletons and howling werewolves, so I decided to go get everything else I needed, then circle back and get the decorations last. I loaded my cart full of party food and drinks and then pushed it back toward the seasonal aisle where there were now only a handful of people left. I was looking through a box of monster masks when I heard footsteps behind me. I just assumed it was someone else waiting to look at them, but when I peered up to smile at them, I saw that same male employee from the entrance. He was just standing there staring at me. I threw a mask back into the box, but as I went to push my cart along, he crept up so close to me that I could smell his stale breath. And then he whispered, "I haven't seen you here before. That's okay. It can be our secret." I found this really unsettling and creepy. I also didn't really know what he meant by that. I gave him an awkward smile, then moved away from him as quickly as possible and hurried toward the checkout line. When I peered back behind me to check he wasn't following, I saw him standing there in the same spot, but this time, he was wearing one of the monster masks. On seeing me looking at him, he waved at me. I quickly turned around and focused on moving along the long line. As I reached the front of the line, the female checkout employee told me it would be a minute. She was just going on her break and her coworker was taking over. I nodded to signal this was fine, but then to my horror, I saw the coworker switching places with her. It was that creepy man. I felt myself begin to panic, but I couldn't just walk off and leave my items there. There were a couple of people behind me now, so that would be even more awkward if I did that. I had no choice but to show this man my membership card that I borrowed from my sister. He lingered on it for what felt like ages and looked back and forth between me and my sister's picture. He kept doing it, about 5 times. By this point, I was ready to just leave my items and run out of there just to get away from him. But then he finally passed me back the ID and with a terrible grin, gestured to my items, called me by my sister's name, and told me it looked like I was planning a great party. I didn't say anything, packed my items and exited the store as quickly as possible. Although this creeped me out, I was also annoyed because I didn't grab any Halloween decorations while trying to avoid that guy, which meant I had to stop off at another store to get them. That evening I called my sister to thank her for lending me the card. I also told her about that weird guy. She laughed about it and agreed with me that he sounded like a creep. Then about an hour later my phone rang. It was my sister. Thinking she'd called because she'd forgotten to tell me something earlier, I answered. My tone soon changed when I heard how frantic she sounded. Then she told me why she was so worked up. She'd gone to pull her curtains shut and seen a man standing in her driveway with a monster mask. Upon seeing her staring at him, he waved at her and just continued standing there, so she'd pulled the curtains shut. My sister was home alone and terrified. I told her to check to make sure all the doors were locked and to look outside again. If he was still there, she needed to call the police. She peered through the curtains and told me he was gone. I asked her to describe the monster mask to me, and it sounded exactly like the same one as the one the Costco man had been wearing. I knew it had to be him. He must have used the membership number to look up her address. My sister was hesitant to report him to Costco as she didn't want to get in trouble for lending me her card, but I told her that we had to, since he could end up doing this to someone else. I ended up calling them and telling them that I'd taken my sister's card without her knowledge so she didn't get in any trouble. They told me not to do this again and said they'd look into the incident with the man in the mask. Neither my sister nor I ever went to that Costco again, and we didn't see the creepy man again either. I don't know why he showed up at my sister's house in that monster mask like that. I guess I'll never know. But being aware that he knows my sister's address and he went to all that effort to scare her is extremely unsettling. One summer break, I decided to stay in Vermont, where I attended college, and I got a job at my local Costco. My job consisted of moving pallets, checking stock and prices, helping customers find items, and working the checkout line. This happened one cloudy evening close to closing time. The weather seemed to affect everyone's moods, and being stuck on the register, I noticed how rude and snappy some of the customers were. It was one of those days, and as my shift came to an end, I was ready to go home. The thing is, I didn't expect events to go from frustrating to downright sinister. With only a couple of minutes to go until closing time, the store was pretty quiet. Only a few customers were left. Then this woman with this pixie haircut and an oversized hoodie slid her items onto the conveyor belt. 2 buckets of red paint and a packet of paintbrushes. As I scanned them through, I noticed how jittery she seemed. She was chewing her sleeve as she peered around her. It genuinely looked as though she was afraid of something. As I finished scanning her items and she walked around the counter to pay, I asked her if everything was all right. She seemed hesitant to speak, but then peered behind her and started shaking. As she paid by card, she leaned in closer to me and whispered that she thought a man was following her. I turned and looked over. I saw a man in a baseball cap staring over at the woman. He wasn't even trying to hide the fact that he was looking at her. I asked the woman if she'd like me to call security, but this seemed to panic her and she looked upset. When I peered back at the spot where the man had just been, I noticed he'd vanished. I figured he must have just snuck out and he could be outside waiting for this woman. As it was closing time and this woman was my last customer, I asked her if she'd like me to walk to her car with her. She still looked frightened, nodded in agreement. We walked in silence, but since she didn't have a cart, I insisted on carrying one of the buckets of paint, so at least this way, if any of my coworkers saw me leaving early, it'd be self-explanatory that I was just helping a customer. Outside, I didn't see any signs of the man, so I just thought he'd left. I asked the woman where her car was, and she pointed to a black van at the far end of the parking lot. I don't know. I know it's bad to make assumptions, but I didn't expect her to be driving a vehicle like that. I also didn't understand why she'd parked so far from the warehouse, especially as she hadn't picked up a cart and the paint buckets were very heavy. Not knowing what else to do, I walked over to the van. When we reached it, she placed the paint and brushes on the ground and tapped on the side of the van. I noticed how different the woman seemed. Her demeanor had completely changed, and a smug smile replaced her nervous look. As she lunged toward me, suddenly the back doors burst open and someone stepped out. Knowing I was in danger, I dropped the paint bucket, which, judging by the grunts and shouts, must have landed on her foot, and I ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the front of the store, where one of the security guards was about to lock the doors to the public. I caught my breath and watched as that van drove past me. The woman snarled at me from the passenger side, and driving was the man in the baseball cap. I knew then that he hadn't been following her. Instead, they were working together to carry out whatever sick plan they had to kidnap me. On seeing how shaken up I was, the security guard led me inside. I told him what happened, and he found the van's license plate from the surveillance footage and reported the vehicle to the police. Turns out it was a fake license plate. As the woman had to use her membership card to make a purchase, my manager looked up her details and handed them to the police, but again, these turned out to be fake. If I hadn't managed to get away when I did, then I had no doubt I would have ended up in the back of that van, and I don't even want to think what would have happened to me. It won't come as a surprise that I quit that job after that. I've never been near that store since. I know I had a lucky escape, but just thinking about what could have been makes me shudder to this very day. My parents reached a point in their toxic relationship where they were always arguing. Although this sucked, I was about to move states for work, so it wasn't me I felt bad for, but rather my younger brother. To try and cheer him up, we had this thing we'd do where I drove him to the Costco a few miles from our home and buy him a bulk load of candy bars and sodas. I know it didn't change the fact that his home life wasn't great at the time, but at least it distracted him from it. Apart from these occasions, I didn't really go to Costco much. I only had the membership because my ex made me join, and I hadn't gotten around to canceling it. Being a Monday evening close to closing time, it wasn't that busy, so I let my brother run off and explore the snack and candy aisles, while I wandered over to the electronics section since I needed a new laptop. The one on display looked like it had good specs, so I was testing out the keyboard when I felt a tap on my shoulder. Expecting it to be my brother, I started asking him what he thought of the laptop, and I turned to look at him. Only it wasn't my brother. Instead, it was a female employee in her 20s, her blonde hair tied in braids. In a muted tone, she told me I needed to leave. I looked at my watch, and it was at least 30 minutes until closing time, so this seemed weird. I smiled at her and said I was just looking at the laptops and waiting for my brother. Then I was going. She again told me I needed to leave and then started grabbing my arm. I instinctively pulled my arm away from her. I didn't want to make a scene or anything, but I didn't like being grabbed by a stranger. I again told her I didn't want any trouble, but the next thing I knew, she'd signaled a security guard over, and she was glaring at me as she escorted me out of the store. I kept explaining that all I'd been doing was looking at laptops, and I couldn't just leave since my brother was still in the store, and he needed my membership card and money to pay. The guard told me I wasn't allowed back in the store, but to wait outside, and he'd go and look for my brother. Seeing as I didn't have much choice, I leaned against a cart return and waited for my brother. By this point, I was angry about how I'd been treated. I just thought the whole thing was really unjustified. Some time passed by, closing time came and went, and my brother still hadn't appeared out of the store. I checked my car to make sure he wasn't waiting there and tried going back to the store, but the door was now closed and locked. I just didn't know where my brother could be and was starting to panic that he'd gotten lost somewhere in there and was wondering why I hadn't gone looking for him. Since I couldn't get inside the store, I tried going around the back and getting into the warehouse that way. It wasn't long before a different security guard came running over to me and told me I couldn't be back there. I explained what happened and just said I needed to find my brother. He made me stay there and said he'd go and look into it. He reappeared about 10 minutes later looking concerned, accompanied by the flustered store manager, who explained that my brother wasn't in the store. They'd watched the surveillance footage back, and he'd left about 30 minutes ago with a woman with her hair in braids. Then the manager told me that the woman may have been wearing an employee name tag, but she wasn't an employee. I was livid about the whole situation and demanded they help me find my brother. They said they'd called the police and tried to bring me inside, but I didn't want to go anywhere with them. I stormed around the side of the building toward my car. This whole thing was terrifying, and I just wanted to know my brother was okay. As I neared my car, I saw someone standing next to it with a bag near his feet. I sighed in relief to see it was my brother, and I ran over to him. He had a piece of candy in his mouth. I frantically asked him where he'd been and why he'd left with that woman. He told me she'd claimed I'd been thrown out of the store and that he'd have to go meet me outside. He said she knew both of our names and claimed she used to go to school with me. This is really creepy and a total lie. I'd never seen that woman before in my life. I asked him if he was hurt, but he shook his head and told me she'd given him the candy. She gave him that bag to give to me and walked with him over to the car and told him to wait for me there. I suddenly panicked and told him to stop eating the candy. I lifted the bag, it was heavy, and peering into it, I instantly dropped it on the ground. It was full of milk cartons, only they weren't full of milk, but this gloopy-looking red substance. As I dropped it, the cartons burst and splattered the red stuff across the ground. I needed us to get away from there, so I drove us home and then called the store. The manager answered and I explained what happened. She didn't seem to have any answers for me about how this was allowed to happen and just told me she was pleased my brother was okay. I have no idea why that woman pretended to be an employee so she could get me out of the store and pass my brother cartons full of whatever that was. I still don't know if that first security guard was in on it too. To this day, years later, the whole thing still doesn't sit right with me. None of it makes any sense. I've tried to think back to that woman's face and if I could place her from anywhere, but no, that was definitely the first time I'd ever seen her. I canceled my Costco membership after that, and me and my brother haven't been back there since.